Welcome. There is no need to move. Whatever you have arranged for yourself is fine. The blanket, the pillow, the temperature of the room, all of it is acceptable as it is. Nothing needs adjusting. What needs only your quiet attention right now is this: a slow, careful, unhurried account of what ordinary daily life was like for a soldier in the Second World War. Not the dramatic version, not the battles and the landings and the moments that appear in films. We're going to talk about the waiting, the marching, the food, the equipment, the sleeping wherever you could sleep, the small routines that organized the long days and the longer nights, the unremarkable texture of a life lived in uniform, far from home, doing what needed to be done and waiting for what came next. This will take a long time. That is the intention. Let us begin. The Second World War lasted from 1939 to 1945 for most of its participants, and for China and parts of Asia it extended both earlier and later. Tens of millions of men and women served in the armed forces of the various nations involved. The majority of these people were not professional soldiers before the war. They were farmers and factory workers and students and shopkeepers and teachers who were called up, drafted or volunteered, and who spent between 1 and 6 years in uniform before the war ended and they returned to ordinary life. The experience of these ordinary soldiers varied enormously depending on where they served, which army they served in, which specific campaign or theatre of war they were part of. A soldier who served in the Pacific Islands had a very different experience from a soldier who served in the North African desert, who had a different experience from a soldier who served on the Eastern Front, who had a different experience from a soldier who served in the Italian mountains or the fields of northern France. But despite all this variation, there were things that most soldiers in most armies shared. The shared experience of a life organized by the military, with its specific rhythms and its specific demands and its specific discomforts and its specific compensations. The shared experience of being away from home and from everyone familiar. The shared experience of waiting. Mostly the waiting. This is something the accounts of the Second World War often underemphasize, because waiting is not dramatic and does not make compelling viewing. But waiting was the dominant experience for most soldiers in most armies in most theatres of the war. For every hour of actual combat there were hundreds of hours of preparation, transit, holding positions, resting, eating, maintaining equipment, sleeping, waiting for orders, waiting for weather, waiting for supplies, waiting for the thing that was supposed to happen. The soldier's life was a life of waiting, punctuated by periods of intense activity. Let us describe the waiting. The typical British infantry soldier of the Second World War woke when he was told to wake, which was typically before dawn. Not because dawn had anything in particular to offer that required waking for it, but because the military day began early as a matter of institutional habit and practical necessity. Dawn was a vulnerable time. The transition from dark to light had tactical implications, and the day's activities needed to begin with enough margin before the activities themselves started. Réveillé, the wake-up call, either a bugle if the unit was operating with that kind of formality, or simply the voice of the NCO moving through the sleeping area, came in the dark. The soldier who had been sleeping on the ground, or in a hole in the ground, or on a wooden board in a tent, or in a requisitioned building, depending on where the unit happened to be,
came out of sleep into cold darkness and began the process of becoming a functioning soldier for the day. First came the management of the body, going to the latrine.
A communal slit trench dug at a specified distance from the sleeping area, in compliance with sanitation regulations that were enforced with some seriousness, because dysentery and other intestinal diseases could incapacitate a unit faster than enemy action. The latrine in the field was an outdoor, often cold, often uncomfortable facility, and the process of using it was one of the daily indignities of field service that former soldiers remembered with clarity long after they had forgotten more dramatic events. Then washing. Water for washing in the field was limited. A mess tin or a steel helmet used as a basin, a small amount of cold water, a bar of army-issue soap. The washing was functional rather than thorough. Face and hands, the essentials. In some periods and some locations, even this minimal washing was difficult. Water was scarce, or the tactical situation made movement to the water point dangerous, or the cold was so extreme that water froze before it could be used. The shaving was important. The British Army, like most armies, required soldiers to shave regularly, even in the field. Not for purely aesthetic reasons. An unshaven face was considered a symptom of declining morale and discipline, and the army was attentive to morale and discipline because it understood that once these began to slip, they could slip quickly. The insistence on shaving in difficult conditions was a way of maintaining the routine that maintained the soldier. Shaving with cold water and a safety razor was not pleasant. The stubble was stiff, the water cold, the razor blade dull from repeated use. Blade replacements were not always immediately available. The process was accomplished without enthusiasm, and without anything approximating the comfort of a peacetime shave at home. Then came the equipment. The infantryman's equipment was considerable. The full kit that a British infantryman carried on his body included the steel helmet, which weighed several pounds and rested on the head throughout the waking hours, the battle dress uniform of the particular theatre, heavy wool serge in Northern Europe, lighter khaki drill in the Mediterranean and Asia, the ammunition boots, heavy leather with metal cleats on the soles, the gaiters wrapped around the lower leg above the boots, the webbing equipment, the system of canvas straps and pouches that carried ammunition, water bottle, field dressing, entrenching tool and other necessities, organized in a specific arrangement on the body. The webbing was put on in a specific order, and the specific order mattered, because getting it wrong meant something essential was in the wrong place when it was needed. The ammunition pouches on the front of the chest, each holding magazines or clips for the rifle, the water bottle on the hip, the entrenching tool, the small folding spade used for digging the holes that protected you, attached at the back, the straps and buckles and adjustment of all of this was done in the dark by feel, the hands knowing the kit from repetition. The rifle was checked. The bolt worked back and forth to ensure the action was clear. The barrel inspected as far as it could be without adequate light. The magazine checked to ensure it was seated correctly. The rifle was the infantryman's primary tool, the thing upon which his life and the lives around him might depend, and no morning was too rushed or too dark to omit the check. The kit check was an institutional reflex. It happened automatically without being ordered, because the consequences of a kit failure in action were too severe to risk. Then breakfast. Breakfast in the field came from the section cook, or from the company cookhouse if one was established, or from the individual soldier's own ration if no cooking facility was available. In the best case, a cooked meal, porridge or bacon and fried bread, or powdered egg scrambled in a mess tin over a small fuel tablet. Tea, strong and sweet, the British military's primary morale maintenance beverage, which was produced in large quantities throughout the day wherever the tactical situation remotely permitted. In less good cases, the cold ration. A tin of bully beef, corned beef, pressed and canned, which could be eaten cold directly from the tin. Hardtack biscuit, which was a severely dense cracker that provided calories and little else, and which required either something to make it edible, fat jam anything, or a determination to eat it for its caloric content regardless of its limited palatability. The soldier ate his breakfast quickly, standing or sitting on his kit, the mess tin balanced on his knee. He ate whatever there was. After weeks of field rations, the appetite had adjusted to the available food, with the pragmatic acceptance of a body that understood it could not choose. The tea was the most important part. This deserves a moment. The significance of tea to the British servicemen in the Second World War is not a cliché or an exaggeration. Tea, properly made and properly sweet, was a genuine morale factor in the British forces, recognised as such at the institutional level. The insistence on producing tea in almost any circumstances, the stories of soldiers making tea under fire, of tea being available moments after a position was taken, reflected a genuine understanding that the brew and the break it represented were important to maintaining the mental state of soldiers under stress. The tea was hot, the tea was sweet, the tea was familiar. In a life of constant unfamiliarity, unfamiliar country, unfamiliar sounds, unfamiliar dangers, the familiar taste of sweet tea was a small but real connection to the ordinary world. He drank his tea. The day had begun. What came next depended entirely on where the unit was and what the current orders were. If the unit was in a static position, holding a defensive line, garrisoning a town, resting and refitting after a period of action, the morning might involve working parties. The digging and improvement of defensive positions, the maintenance of the transport vehicles, the cleaning and maintenance of weapons, the carrying of supplies from the delivery point to the forward positions, the repair of communication lines. These working parties were tiring, unglamorous labour that the soldier did because it was required, not because it was interesting. The digging of slit trenches, the individual fighting positions that every soldier was expected to dig whenever they stopped in a location that might require defence, was particularly disliked. The entrenching tool was small, the ground often hard, the digging slow and exhausting. To dig a proper slit trench to regulation depth, deep enough to provide cover when standing or kneeling, required 30 minutes to an hour of sustained digging effort in normal soil conditions. But the slit trench was important. The difference between having a slit trench and not having one, when artillery or aircraft arrived overhead, was the difference between being under cover and not being under cover. Every soldier who had experienced shelling knew this. Every soldier who had experienced shelling dug his slit trench without being told. The American infantryman had his own version of these routines. The US Army's ration system was somewhat different from the British. The K ration, the C ration, each with their specific contents and their specific characteristics. The K-ration was a compact package containing a small canned meat item, crackers, a candy bar, bouillon powder, instant coffee, and cigarettes. It was designed to provide one meal's calories in a compact and durable package for use when cooking was impossible. The soldiers who ate K-rations day after day, which happened when units were in constant movement or contact, developed strong opinions about each of the ration's components. The canned meat varied. The cheese and ham element was generally considered tolerable. The egg and bacon element was considered less so. The crackers were the same crackers regardless of which variant of the ration it was. The instant coffee was instant coffee, which was what it was. Cigarettes were included in rations and were issued to soldiers who did not smoke as well as to those who did, because cigarettes were currency. They could be traded for other things. The non-smoker with his cigarette ration had a trading resource. The smoker depended on the ration for a product that was for many as essential as food. Let us now think about marching. The infantry moved on foot. This sounds obvious, but the physical reality of it is worth considering. An infantry unit moving from one position to another covered the distance between those positions by walking, carrying everything they needed on their bodies. 30 pounds of kit on an ordinary day, 50 pounds or more when the full kit was required. Hawking 10 miles, 15 miles, 20 miles at a stretch on roads that might be in excellent condition or might be churned to mud by artillery and vehicle traffic. The march was one of the defining physical experiences of the infantryman's war. Not the most dramatic, not the most dangerous, but among the most pervasive. Soldiers marched to get to the fighting. They marched to move away from the fighting. They marched to get to where the fighting was going to be. They marched in darkness and in daylight, in heat and in cold, on good roads and bad ones. The rhythm of the march was an established thing. The pace was set to allow sustained movement over distance, not a quick pace, but a steady one. Stops were built in, 10 minutes in every hour, the column halting, the soldiers sitting on the side of the road with their backs against their packs, the pack taking their weight and allowing a brief rest. The 10-minute halt was not pleasant exactly. The boots came back off if there was time, or the feet were aired if there was not. The pack was set against a wall or a bank, the weight removed from the shoulders. The cigarette was lit if one was available. The water bottle was not drunk from, unless the halt was a longer one and replenishment was available because the water had to last. And then the order to fall in, and the march resumed. The feet were the infantry soldiers' most important physical asset, and the source of their most persistent discomfort. The army boot, heavy leather metal-studded sole, was designed for durability rather than comfort, and it performed its function at the cost of the foot inside it. Blisters were universal, managed with the field dressing materials every soldier carried, and with the boots being changed as rarely as the tactical situation allowed. Trench foot was the extreme version of foot problems. When soldiers stood or sat in waterlogged positions for extended periods, the feet became vulnerable to serious damage, the skin softening, the blood circulation impaired, the tissue at risk. Trench foot had been a major problem in the First World War, and the Second World War armies worked to prevent it through regular inspection of soldiers' feet, the enforcement of dry sock changes where possible, and foot care routines that were taken seriously as military discipline. The NCO who inspected his section's feet was doing so under orders, and the soldier who neglected his feet was subject to punishment, because a soldier with trench foot was a soldier who could not march. Let us now think about sleep. Sleep in the field was taken wherever and whenever it could be managed. The luxury of a proper bed disappeared with the departure from England or America, or wherever the soldier had started, and what replaced it was a range of sleeping surfaces that none of them would have chosen. The ground itself was the most basic. A ground sheet, a waterproof square of material spread on the earth, the blanket roll opened, the soldier lying on one half and pulling the other over himself. In winter, a greatcoat as an additional layer. This arrangement was cold, damp, and uncomfortable by civilian standards, and it was what field service often provided. The sleeping bag was an improvement, where it was issued. The American Army's mountain sleeping bag was a genuinely good piece of equipment, a thick, insulated bag that kept a soldier warm in temperatures that would otherwise make sleep impossible. Getting into it required removing the boots, which created the tactical problem of not being immediately ready to move if the position came under attack in the night. The compromise most soldiers reached was to sleep with the boots unlaced but not removed, or to remove one boot at a time and replace it before removing the other. The tent was better than the open ground. The two-man pup tent of the American Army, two shelter halves buttoned together, supported by a short pole at each end, was a standard piece of equipment. Two soldiers shared the responsibility of carrying the components, and when the unit stopped for the night, the tents went up quickly. The pup tent was small, you could not sit upright inside it, and provided waterproofing rather than warmth. But the psychological benefit of being enclosed, even in a small and uncomfortable enclosure, was real. In buildings, the requisitioned farmhouses and barns and village halls and churches that housed soldiers throughout the war in every theatre, the sleeping was better. A floor was better than the ground. A barn with hay was better than a bare floor. A bed, actual bed, was a luxury that happened occasionally and was remembered vividly. The German soldier on the Eastern Front sleeping in a building had a different relationship to the building than the American or British soldier in the West, because the Eastern Front's winters were extreme in a way that the Western theatres were not. The temperature at which it became truly dangerous to sleep in the open in Russia was reached regularly. The buildings were not comfort, they were survival. Sleep was interrupted regularly. The watch rotation, 2 hours on, 2 hours off, 3 hours on, 3 hours off. The specific schedule varied, but the principle was the same. You were never off watch for long enough to complete a full night's sleep in a single uninterrupted stretch. The watches meant waking at some inconvenient middle-of-the-night hour, doing your 2 hours of peering into the darkness and then trying to get back to sleep. Getting back to sleep after a 2-hour watch at 3 a.m. was something that soldiers who had been doing it for months accomplished quickly, because exhaustion was the baseline condition and the body seized whatever opportunity it had. Getting back to sleep after a 2-hour watch at 3 a.m. in November in the Ardennes was harder, because the cold worked against the body's capacity for the relaxation that sleep required. Let us now think about the equipment in more detail. The British infantryman's rifle was the Lee Enfield, the short magazine Lee Enfield, Mark III or the later No. 4, a bolt-action rifle that had been the British Army's primary weapon since before the First World War. It was a well-designed, robust, reliable weapon that soldiers who carried it generally spoke of with something like affection. The affection of someone who trusts a thing that has served them well. The bolt action was smooth and fast. Trained soldiers could fire 15 rounds per minute with accurate aimed shots, a rate that was impressive for a bolt-action weapon. The magazine held 10 rounds. The loading was done with 5-round charger clips, 2 clips filling the magazine. The process of loading, firing, working the bolt, loading again was automatic after training, the hands doing the work without requiring attention. The rifle was cleaned every day, not every day in the abstract sense of sometimes, every actual day, including the days when nothing was happening, and including the days when everything was happening. The cleaning kit, a pull-through with a flannel, a bottle of oil, a small brush for the bolt mechanism. The barrel was pulled through with the flannel until the flannel came out clean. The bolt was oiled. The working parts were checked for grit and mud. The exterior was wiped. This was not optional. A dirty rifle misfired or jammed at the moment when it was most needed, and a rifle that jammed at the moment it was most needed was potentially fatal. The daily cleaning of the rifle was as fundamental a discipline as eating. The American soldier's M1 Garand was a semi-automatic rather than bolt-action rifle. Each trigger pull fired 1 round, the gas-operated action cycling the next round automatically. This gave a higher rate of fire than the Lee Enfield and was considered a tactical advantage. The M1 was also cleaned daily with the same ritualistic consistency. The maintenance of weapons, vehicles, radios, and all other equipment was the most consistent occupation of the soldier's time when not in action. The army ran on its equipment, and its equipment ran on maintenance. The mechanic who kept the vehicles running, the signaller who kept the radio working, the soldier who kept his rifle clean, all of them were performing the unglamorous work that made the operational side of the war possible. Let us think about water. The supply of clean drinking water to a forward unit at the field was one of the most logistically demanding aspects of military operations. The water point, typically a bulk supply tanker or a purification point at a stream, was at some distance from the forward positions, and getting water from the water point to the soldiers who needed it required transport and management. Each soldier carried 1 water bottle, a metal canteen in the American system, a glass-lined canteen in the British system, of approximately 1 litre capacity. This was the personal water supply, to be managed carefully and replenished at the water point when opportunity allowed. Managing 1 litre of water through a day of physical activity in warm weather required deliberate rationing. You did not drink freely. You took small sips at intervals, postponing the next sip as long as possible, conserving what remained for the heart of the day when replenishment was less certain. In the desert, the North African campaign, where the British 8th Army and the German Afrika Korps fought across the Libyan and Egyptian desert, water was the most critical resource of the entire operation. Both sides' ability to advance was limited by their ability to supply water forward. A soldier in the desert drank his ration carefully, because there was nothing casual about water in that environment. In less extreme environments, the water supply was merely inconvenient, rather than potentially fatal, but it was always something that required thought and management. The purification tablets, iodine tablets that could make suspect water safe enough to drink were part of the standard kit. Their taste was specific and not pleasant, and water treated with purification tablets tasted of iodine in a way that you became accustomed to over time, the way you become accustomed to many things over time when there is no alternative. Now let us think about letters. The mail was the umbilical cord between the soldier and the life he had left behind. Letters from home arrived in bundles when they arrived at all, carried forward through the regimental postal system, which worked imperfectly but worked. A soldier might receive no mail for 2 weeks, and then receive 8 letters in a day, the accumulated correspondence catching up in one bundle. Reading a letter from home in the field was a specific experience. You took the letter to somewhere that gave you a moment's privacy, if such a moment was available, or you read it sitting among your section with the internal privacy of concentration. The letter told you about home, the garden, the family, the news of the street, the progress of your younger sibling who was growing up in your absence, the health of your parents, the small events of ordinary civilian life. The small events of ordinary civilian life, described in detail in a letter, had a quality in the field that they did not have when you were living them. The ordinary was made vivid by the contrast with the extraordinary. The news that the neighbour's cat had come back after being missing for a week, which would have been mildly interesting in normal times, was absorbing reading in a slit trench in Holland. Writing letters home was also part of the rhythm. You wrote when you could, which was never as often as you wanted to or intended to, because the demands of the military day left limited time and limited conditions suitable for writing. A letter written in the field, leaning against a pack by the light of a small torch, in the pauses of an otherwise occupied day, was the best that many soldiers could manage. The letters home were censored, read by a censor who removed any information that might be useful to the enemy if the letter was intercepted, which meant anything about location, movements, or unit activities. Soldiers learned to write around the censor, communicating in the oblique way of people who know that what they write will be read before it is sent. Let us now think about the sounds. The soundscape of the soldiers' war was specific, and is one of the things that veterans found most consistently impossible to describe adequately to those who had not experienced it. The artillery. The sound of outgoing artillery, your own guns firing, was different from incoming artillery. The outgoing round produced a specific sharp crack, followed by the sound of the shell in flight, a rushing sound that diminished quickly as the shell moved away. The incoming round produced a different sequence, a rushing sound that grew louder, followed by the impact and the explosion, the sound of the detonation, and then the secondary sounds of things disturbed by it. The difference between outgoing and incoming was learned quickly and was important. Outgoing you could ignore more or less. Incoming required response. But between the firing and the incoming, the artillery also produced a continuous background sound when a bombardment was in progress at some distance. The distant rumble, the specific sound of a great deal of explosives detonating at a distance, which was one of the defining ambient sounds of the Second World War in the various theatres where artillery was heavily used. In the quiet between bombardments, or in sectors where there was no active fighting, the sounds were ordinary. Birds, wind, the sounds of vehicles on distant roads, the sounds of the unit's own activity. These ordinary sounds had a quality of strange normality that many soldiers noticed and remarked upon. The contrast between the peacetime normality of birds singing and the context in which you were hearing them. At night, the sounds of the night were different from the day. The insects in warm climates, the distant sounds of movement, which was your own movement or theirs, and which you were not always certain of. The occasional flare, which turned night briefly into white day, and revealed the landscape in stark relief, before fading and leaving you more blind than before. The sounds of men sleeping around you, breathing, turning, the occasional murmur. The night was always the most psychologically demanding period. The darkness that was cover for both sides, the uncertainty that the darkness created, the accumulated tiredness of the day pressing against the requirement to maintain alertness. The night was when the imagination produced its most active work, and the imagination of a soldier in a forward position did not always produce restful material. Let us now think about boredom. Boredom was one of the most universal experiences of the soldier's war, and one of the least discussed. Combat was intense and focused and terrifying. The rest of the time was frequently very boring. In a static sector, when the unit was holding ground rather than advancing or retreating, the routine was the same day after day. Stand to at dawn, morning routine, working parties, the maintenance of weapons and equipment, patrols when ordered, stand to at dusk, the night watches, sleep when you could get it, the same the next day, and the day after, for weeks. The boredom was not the comfortable boredom of having nothing to do on a quiet afternoon. It was the specific boredom of a monotonous routine maintained in uncomfortable conditions, with the background awareness that the monotony might at any moment be interrupted by something violent and terrible. This awareness prevented the full relaxation that genuine rest required, while the routine offered nothing to occupy the attention. Soldiers managed boredom in the ways people always manage boredom: games, conversation, sleep, reading, writing letters, doing whatever small tasks came to hand. Card games were universal. A pack of cards could be played in almost any conditions and provided engagement for multiple soldiers simultaneously. The games played were not always the sophisticated games of peacetime. They were often the most basic gambling games, the simplicity suited to the limited attention available, reading whatever could be obtained. The army provided some material, newspapers when available, official publications, educational booklets, but the supply of reading material in the field was erratic. A book found in a requisitioned house was read by everyone in the section who could read and wanted to. The book might not be in the soldier's language, in which case the pictures, if there were pictures, provided something. Conversations, the same conversations to some extent revisited over months. Home, food, women, the particular idiocies of higher command, what you would do when it was over. The conversations of men who knew each other very well from extended proximity, and who had covered most of the available ground but returned to familiar territory because it was familiar. Now let us think about the moment before sleep. In whatever sleeping place the soldier had found, the slit trench, the pup tent, the barn floor, the rare and precious bed, the moment before sleep was the moment when the day finally let go. The body, which had been doing the day's work, lay horizontal. The equipment was as near to hand as the tactical situation required, the rifle within reach always, the boots on or off depending on how quickly you might need to move, the ground sheet or blanket organized around the body. The sounds of the position were the sounds of the position, the sounds you listened to automatically, the sounds that would alert you to something requiring response separated by training and experience from the sounds that were simply the background of the night. And in the space between waking and sleep, the thoughts, home, the specific image of home that served as the reference point for everything else, the kitchen, perhaps, or the front door, or the face of someone specific. Not always articulate thoughts, often just the image, held for a moment, and then dissolving into the approach of sleep. What had happened today? What might happen tomorrow? Questions without answers, held briefly, and then set down because the morning would bring what it brought, and speculation served nothing. And then sleep. For the soldier who had been awake for 20 hours, or who had slept only in brief interrupted patches, the sleep came quickly. The body was efficient about it. The luxury of choosing when to sleep had been removed by the military day, and the body had adapted by sleeping whenever the opportunity existed, without requiring the preconditions that civilian sleep sometimes required. You lay down, you closed your eyes, you slept, as simply as that. And now the night is here, and the day that was, whatever it was, is behind you, and the kit is set aside, and the rifle is cleaned, or the whatever the modern equivalent is of the day's work is set down, and you are horizontal, and the sounds of your position, wherever you are around you, and sleep is close, as it was close for the soldier in his slit trench, or his pup tent, or his barn floor. The same body's need, the same quiet approach of the thing that restored them for the next day. Sleep now. Good night. For those still awake. If you're still awake, the war has more to tell. There is more of the ordinary detail of the soldier's life that is worth describing, because the detail is what makes it real, and the real, described slowly enough, settles the mind. Let us think about the equipment the soldier carried in more detail. The steel helmet was perhaps the most immediately distinguishing item of the Second World War soldier's kit. The British Brodie helmet, the distinctive shallow bowl shape, had been in service since the First World War, and was still the standard in 1939. The American M1 helmet was a deeper design that provided more protection to the sides and back of the head. The German Stahlhelm had its own distinctive shape. The helmet weighed several pounds and was worn all day and much of the night. In warm weather, it was hot. In cold weather, it was cold, and the specific cold of metal against the forehead in freezing temperatures was unpleasant. The chin strap, when worn as intended, added a slight pressure under the chin that was an annoyance over hours. But the helmet worked. It stopped fragments that would otherwise have caused injury or death. Every soldier who had been near an artillery burst that sent fragments past their helmeted head understood the helmet's value in a way that made the discomfort irrelevant. The anti-gas cape, a waterproof sheet issued early in the war against the possibility of chemical weapon attack, was bulky and uncomfortable, and was largely not used for its intended purpose, but served adequately as an additional waterproof layer against rain. The gas mask, carried in its cylindrical case at the hip, was another heavy and awkward item that was required to be carried and was never used in the European theatre, because neither side used chemical weapons in the field, having learned from the First World War that the tactical gain was insufficient to justify the political cost. The gas mask case was sometimes used as a bag for food or personal items when the tactical situation made this relaxation of regulations possible, which it occasionally did. The entrenching tool, the small folding spade, was attached to the back of the webbing and swung with every step. Not heavy but present, a constant reminder of the fact that stopping meant digging. Every experienced soldier's reaction to arriving at a new position was automatic. Where do I dig? The field dressing, the standard military first aid bandage sealed in a sterile wrapper, was carried in a specific pocket of the battle dress where it could be found quickly in an emergency. You knew where it was. Everyone in the section knew where everyone else's was, because in an emergency you might need it and might need it fast. These were the things on the body. In the pack on the back were more things. The spare socks, which were genuinely important and not trivial. The spare rations for the day when the supply failed. The ground sheet, the blanket, the shaving kit. Whatever personal items had been allowed, and the letters from home, folded and carried, read many times. The pack was heavy. Not so heavy that it prevented movement, but heavy, enough that the end of a long march was defined partly by the relief of setting it down, the shoulders freed of the weight, the back straightening. Setting down the pack at the end of a march or at the end of a day was one of the simple physical pleasures available to the infantryman. Not complicated, not subtle, just the removal of weight that had been present for hours, the lightness that followed, and the lying down, which was also simple. Not a comfortable lying down, not the soft bed and the warm room, just the horizontal, the removal of the vertical effort, the submission to whatever surface was available, and the sleep that followed, which was the same sleep regardless of the surface. The body's requirement met, as yours is met right now. The pack is set down, the weight is off, the horizontal is here, and sleep. Good night. The wait before. The action. The wait before action was a specific kind of waiting, not the general boredom of the static sector, which was the boredom of the indefinite, of nothing particular being about to happen. The wait before action was the boredom of the specific, of something particular being absolutely about to happen, and you being required to wait for it in a state of controlled readiness. The night before an attack, the unit assembled at its start line, the briefings done, the orders given, the positions occupied, and then the hours between assembly and H hour, the time of the attack. In those hours, soldiers dealt with the weight in various ways. Some slept, or attempted to. The body's demand for sleep was strong enough that some men genuinely dozed in the hours before an attack. Some talked quietly to the man next to them, the conversation covering the usual topics or covering no specific topic, simply the sound of another voice in the dark. Some were silent, their attention turned inward, whatever that interior space held being their own business. The cigarette was lit under the cover of a ground sheet or a cupped hand, no light to be seen by the enemy. The cigarette was smoked slowly, the warmth of it, the familiar action of it, the small sensory normalcy of it useful in the specific way that familiar things are useful in unfamiliar conditions. Water was drunk carefully. The water bottle that would need to last through the action ahead was not a resource to be consumed casually in the wait. The equipment was checked one more time, though it had been checked already. Not because it needed to be checked again, it did not, it was fine, but because checking it was something to do and something that was constructive within the constraints of the wait. The order came, and then there was no more waiting. But the waiting we are describing is not the action. The action is not this story. This story is the waiting, and the eating, and the sleeping, and the marching, and all the ordinary texture of the days that were not the action. This story is the long hours between actions that made up most of the war for most of the soldiers who served in it. The tea drunk out of the mess tin, the letter written on a piece of army issue notepaper, the boot unlaced and the sock carefully inspected and replaced, the shovel worked into the earth of the next position, the rifle drawn through with the flannel one more time. These things, these ordinary things, which were the war for most of the time, and now the war is over. For all of them, eventually the war ended, and they came home, or they did not come home, but the war ended, and the particular experience of being a soldier in it ended with the war. And the tools and the habits and the routines of the soldier's life were set down, as the pack was set down at the end of the march, and ordinary life resumed, as the ordinary life of this night resumes, in the quiet, in the dark, after the day, before the morning, sleep, good night. The food in more detail. Let us spend more time with the food, because the food was one of the most persistently present concerns of the soldier's daily life, and because thinking about food in detail has a certain settling quality. The British Army's field ration, the composite ration, or compo ration, came in a wooden box containing enough food for 14 men for 1 day, or 7 men for 2 days, packed in a specific and well-considered assortment. The compo box was a genuine achievement of military logistics, designed to provide adequate calories and nutrition in a compact and durable package. Inside the compo box, tins of steak and kidney pudding, which was considered one of the better items, tins of meat and vegetable stew, which was considered adequate, tins of processed cheese, which was considered with varying degrees of enthusiasm, depending on how long it had been the available protein, tinned fruit, peaches or apricots or pears, a genuine luxury in the field, coveted and sometimes subject to careful management to ensure equitable distribution. Biscuits, the hard, dense army biscuit that required soaking in water or tea to be easily eaten. Boiled sweets, which provided sugar and were popular. Powdered milk for tea. Blocks of tea, designed to be made in the large mess tin. The opening of a new compo box was an event. The contents were distributed. The preferences of the section were known. Who liked the M&V stew, who didn't. Who would trade a tin of pudding for 2 tins of fruit. The small economics of ration distribution were conducted with the seriousness of genuine commerce. Supplementing the ration was always welcome, and always attempted when the opportunity arose. Eggs bought from a farm, if the farmyard had not been cleared out by the previous dozen units to pass through. Bread from a bakery if a bakery was operating. Vegetables from a kitchen garden if a kitchen garden was accessible. Fresh meat if an animal had been found. The supplement to the ration was variable and unreliable, but it was looked for and found when it could be found. The soldier who had spent weeks on compo rations ate a fresh egg with a gratitude that would have surprised his peacetime self. Cooking in the field was done on the small petrol or solid fuel cooker that most sections carried. The Tommy cooker, a small tin can containing a block of hexamine fuel tablet, burned with a small, hot, nearly invisible flame that could heat a mess tin of water for tea in a few minutes. The fuel tablets were compact and reliable, and were used throughout the war by soldiers of many armies. The mess tin was the primary cooking and eating vessel, a rectangular metal tin with a folding handle, It could be held over the Tommy cooker flame or set on the edge of a fire. The stew was heated in it. The tea was boiled in it. The meal was eaten from it. At the end of the meal, the mess tin was washed, the most basic washing in whatever water was available, and stowed. It would be used again at the next meal. This cycle, the ration opened, the food prepared in the mess tin, the meal eaten, the mess tin washed and stowed, was repeated 3 times a day, or as many times as the tactical situation allowed for the duration of field service. The ritual of it, the familiar sequence, was another of the small normalizing elements of military life, the daily reinstatement of an ordinary rhythm in an extraordinary context. The mess tin at the end of the meal, the tea cooling in it, the last swallow, and the mess tin packed away, and the soldier leaning back against whatever there is to lean against, and the day a little more complete, and sleep a little closer. Good night. The maps. The maps of the Second World War deserve a moment because maps were everywhere in the operational environment and were a constant feature of the soldier's life. Military maps were highly detailed. The Ordnance Survey maps of Britain, the IGN maps of France, the German Army's own cartographic surveys of every country they occupied or planned to operate in. These were precise documents that showed terrain, roads, villages, contour lines, and a great deal of other information in a standard format that trained soldiers could read quickly and accurately. Every officer carried maps of his operational area. Senior NCOs often had them. Even private soldiers in some contexts were shown maps of the immediate operation, the attack this morning, the route to the objective. Reading a map with a compass, orienting yourself in an unfamiliar landscape with reference to the sheet in your hand, was a basic military skill that was taught in training and used constantly in the field. The map told you where you were. The map told you where you were going. The map told you what terrain you would cross to get there, the hill that would provide cover, the river that would require crossing, the road junction that would orient the advance. Map reading was not glamorous work. It was often done in the dark by the light of a carefully shielded torch, the map spread on a board or a knee, the grid references noted and checked and renoted. It was a form of continuous navigation, the landscape and the map held together in the mind, the real terrain matched against the sheet, the position continuously updated. A soldier who was very good at map reading was valuable, not because the skill was rare, but because in the confusion of actual operations, when smoke and dust and noise and the fog of movement made everything uncertain, the soldier who could place himself precisely on the ground relative to his objectives was contributing something important to the unit's functioning. Maps were sometimes wrong, not wildly wrong, but wrong in the specific ways that maps of rapidly changing situations were wrong. Roads that had been destroyed, bridges that had been blown, buildings that had been reduced to rubble, landscape features that had been modified by the passage of heavy vehicles or by the impact of artillery. The map showed the landscape as it was before the fighting arrived. The landscape as it was now required constant updating against direct observation. The map and the ground together. Neither alone was sufficient. This combination, the abstract document and the specific reality held in comparison, each informing the other, was one of the continuous cognitive tasks of military service. The map was folded and put away at the end of the operational day, and the soldier lay down where the map had brought him, and slept as you lie down, where your day has brought you, and sleep. Good night. The mud. There is no story of the Second World War that is complete without the mud. The Western Front of the First World War is associated with mud in the popular imagination, but the Second World War had its own mud, and it was extensive and pervasive, and one of the most consistently miserable features of the European and Pacific campaigns. Mud is wet earth. It sounds simple. Its specific quality varied. The thick clay mud of the Dutch polders that sucked at boots with every step. The thin liquid mud of the Italian mountainsides after rain that ran in sheets and made every surface treacherous. The deep mud of the Belgian and German forests in autumn and winter. Each was mud, and each was its own specific misery. The combat soldier in mud was a soldier who moved slowly, who was wet, whose equipment was heavy with the absorbed water, whose boots required constant attention to prevent the mud from working its way inside, and whose sleeping position, whatever it was in contact with the wet earth. The digging of positions in muddy ground produced liquid mud that slid back into the excavation almost as quickly as it was removed. The slit trench filled slowly with groundwater from below, even when no rain was falling. The soldier in a flooded slit trench stood in water at some stage of the digging and occupation. The care of wet equipment in the field was a perpetual task. Wet leather hardens and cracks as it dries. Wet wool loses its insulating properties. Wet metal rusts. The soldier who had been through mud attempted to dry his equipment whenever a period of rest allowed it, spreading items near whatever heat source was available. The boots were the most critical item to maintain in wet conditions. Dubbin, a waxy compound rubbed into leather to waterproof it and keep it supple, was issued and applied with varying degrees of conscientiousness. The boots that were properly maintained shed water adequately. The boots that were not maintained allowed water to penetrate the leather within a few hours of wet walking. The specific smell of wet mud, wet wool, wet leather, wet earth, and the collective presence of many wet soldiers in a confined space was the smell of the European land campaign in the wet seasons. Not a pleasant smell, not terrible, either. It was simply the smell of mud and wet, the smell of the physical environment. The morning after a night in wet conditions, when the mud had dried somewhat on the uniform in the overnight warmth of the body, and the leather of the boots had stiffened in the cold, the soldier rose into the specific discomfort of wet clothing that had dried at an uncomfortable angle on the body. You moved through it. The discomfort was noted and set aside because there was work to do, and the discomfort was the background condition, not something to be addressed before the work could proceed. And at the end of the day in the mud, the sleep on whatever relatively dry surface could be found, with whatever covering was available, the body generating its own warmth under the wool and the ground sheet, and sleep, which did not require dryness, which came regardless, as sleep comes regardless, now, in the warmth of wherever you are, which is warm, which is dry, which is sufficient. Good night. The night watch, the 2-hour watch, or the 3-hour watch, depending on the rotation. This was a specific experience that every frontline soldier had many times. You had been asleep, not deeply asleep probably. The sleep of the field was rarely the deep, complete sleep of a safe bed, but asleep, the body resting. The man who was on before you woke you at the appointed time. He shook your shoulder or touched your boot, the signal that the watch was changing. You came awake quickly. The field taught you to wake quickly and completely. The slow surfacing from sleep that civilian life allowed not being available when you might need to respond immediately. You took your position, a particular spot in the position, an agreed observation point where you could see what needed to be seen and could hear what needed to be heard. 2 hours in the dark, looking at the dark, listening to the dark for anything that was different from the normal sounds and sights of the night. This required a specific kind of attention, not the alert attention of active work, not the relaxed attention of leisure, but the sustained attentiveness of someone who must not miss the thing that matters while maintaining the capacity to detect it over a long period. Too tense and the attention fatigued quickly. Too relaxed and the attention drifted below the necessary threshold. The experienced soldier found the level. Not comfortable exactly, but sustainable. The eyes moving in a pattern across the visible arc. The ears listening for the sounds that did not belong. The mind present, but not actively doing anything except being present. In 2 hours, the mind wandered considerably despite the intention to maintain focus. You thought about home. You thought about the day that had just been. You thought about what would happen when this was over. You thought about food. You thought about sleep. And then you pulled the attention back to the darkness and the silence, and the pattern resumed. Eyes moving, ears listening, present. And eventually the 2 hours were done, and you woke the next man, and you went back to your sleeping position, and you were asleep within minutes, as you're approaching sleep right now, without the watch, without the rotation, simply the dark, simply the quiet, and the sleep that comes in it. Good night. The day. The war ended. The day the war ended was different depending on where you were and which war it was. For the soldiers in Europe, the war in Europe ended on the 8th of May 1945 when Germany surrendered. For soldiers in the Pacific, it ended on the 2nd of September 1945 when Japan surrendered. These days, VE Day and VJ Day, were days of genuine relief and celebration for the soldiers who were alive to experience them. Not uniformly joyful, the responses to the end of the war were complex, shaped by what individuals had lost and what they had endured. But the relief was real. The war was over. What followed the end of the war was not an immediate return home. Soldiers who had been fighting in Germany or France or Italy or the Pacific Islands did not simply get on a ship and come home the next day. They waited for demobilization, the process of returning the military to civilian footing, which took months. There were occupation duties to perform, administrative processes to complete, transportation to be arranged for millions of people spread across the globe. The waiting that had been the primary experience of the war continued for months after the war's end. But the waiting after the war was a different waiting. The specific anxiety of frontline service, the knowledge that at any moment the routine might be interrupted by something violent, was gone. The waiting was the ordinary waiting of bureaucratic process, the frustration of logistics, the impatience of people who wanted to go home and could not go yet, and eventually they went home. They came back through the port where they had departed, and the port looked the same or different, and the people who met them were the same or older, and home was the same or changed in the ways that years change things. They set down the kit. The rifle went back to the armory. The uniform was folded for the last time, the boots were cleaned and stored, the demobilization suit, the civilian clothes issued to returning soldiers who might have nothing else to wear, was put on, and the soldier was a civilian again. The years that followed, the return to ordinary life, the resumption of the work and the family and the ordinary texture of peacetime existence, were shaped in ways both visible and invisible by what had been. The bodies carried the physical marks, the hearing damaged by artillery, the lungs affected by smoke, the injuries healed but present. The minds carried what minds carry from extreme experience, the dreams, the patterns of reaction, the specific things that triggered specific responses, but also the knowledge that ordinary things were extraordinary. The warm bed, the hot food, the dry room, the freedom to sleep until you woke rather than until you were woken, the absence of the watch rotation, the presence of the people you had been away from. These ordinary things, which the civilian life took for granted, were known to the returning soldier in a different way, the way that things are known when their absence has been experienced. You are in the ordinary things right now, the warm bed or the warm room, the dry surface to sleep on, the absence of the watch rotation, the freedom to sleep until you wake. These are the things, simply here, available, without the contrast of their absence that the returning soldier felt, but here, and sufficient, and the sleep that follows is the sleep of the ordinary and the safe, which is the best sleep. Good night. The small rituals. The small rituals of the soldier's life were the mechanisms that maintained the sense of self through conditions that worked against the maintenance of self. The letter written home, even when there was little to say and little time to say it, was a ritual of connection with the person you had been before the war and the person you intended to be after. The shave, in whatever water was available, was a ritual of the body's dignity maintained. The cleaning of the rifle was a ritual of competence and reliability, of being the person who could be trusted with the responsibility of the weapon. The tea, whenever it could be made, was a ritual of comfort and of continuity with the culture that had produced you and that you were representing in the field. These rituals were maintained not because they were required. In conditions where survival was the primary concern, many of them could have been abandoned, but because they were worth maintaining. They were the small evidences of the self that persisted through the extraordinary. The returning soldier brought these rituals back with him, or some of them. The habit of the morning shave was sometimes maintained with a consistency that had not characterized his peacetime self. The habit of the tea at specific times of the day. The habit of checking, of maintaining, of not leaving things to look after themselves. These habits were the residue of the military life in the civilian life, and they were not all bad. Some of them were very good. The attention to detail, the maintenance of basic standards, the knowledge that small things, done consistently, prevented the larger failures. Your own small rituals of the day are behind you now, whatever they were, whatever small evidences of the self you maintain today. They are done, and the ritual of sleep is here, the most basic ritual, the one that all the others lead toward, the lying down, the closing of the eyes, the surrender to the dark, and the sleep. Good night. The long lines of memory. All the soldiers of the Second World War, the men and women who served in the armies and navies and air forces of all the nations involved, are now in the distant past. The last survivors are very old. Most of them are gone. what they experienced over those years, the specific smells and sounds and textures of their service, the specific quality of the waiting, the specific weight of the kit, the specific taste of the compo ration, the specific sound of the 2-hour watch in the dark. All of this is fading from living memory and entering the historical record. But while they were living it, it was as vivid and as immediate as anything is when you're inside it. The mud was mud. The cold was cold. The tea was hot. The letters from home were read many times, and at night, the sleeping. In the slit trench, or the pup tent, or the barn, or wherever the day had brought them. The same need, the same dark, the same sleep. That sleep is behind them now, as your sleep is ahead of you, in the same dark, with the same need, and the same quiet approach of the thing that restores you for tomorrow. The long lines of people who have gone to sleep, from the medieval carpenter in his loft to the Egyptian farmer on his reed mat, to the desert caravan traveller under the stars, to the Roman slave on his mat, to the sailor on the Atlantic passage, to the soldier in his slit trench, all of them in their specific place, at their specific time, with their specific day behind them, all of them with the same need, all of them finding the same rest, and you, tonight, in the long line, the same need, the same dark, the same sleep. Good night. The German soldier's daily life in the Second World War had its own specific texture, different from the British or American experience in particular ways, and similar in others. The Wehrmacht, the German armed forces, was a large and varied institution. The soldier serving on the Eastern Front in 1943 had an experience entirely different from the soldier serving in France in 1940. The organisation was the same in its structure. The conditions were radically different. On the Eastern Front, the scale was different from anything in the Western theatres. The distances were enormous. The front lines ran for thousands of miles. The armies involved were larger, the casualties were greater, and the conditions, particularly in the Russian winters, were extreme in ways that the Western Front rarely was. The German army had not fully prepared for a Russian winter in 1941. The assumption had been that the campaign would be over before winter arrived. When it was not, soldiers who had been equipped for a summer campaign faced temperatures of -20 or -30 degrees Celsius without adequate winter clothing, without the insulated boots and gloves and coats that such temperatures required. The German soldier of the Eastern Front learned cold in a way that soldiers in milder theatres did not. The specific cold of metal in extreme low temperatures, the rifle that was left in the cold would jam because the oil in the mechanism had frozen, and the soldier who had not maintained the weapon for cold conditions found this out at the worst possible moment. The specific cold of a metal button touched with bare fingers, which stuck. The cold that made moving slowly feel dangerous, because slowing down meant less heat generated by the body. The Eastern Front soldier developed habits specific to the conditions, sleeping with the rifle to keep it from freezing, insulating the water bottle against the body to prevent the water from freezing, the management of the small quantities of warmth available, the body's own heat, the small field stove when fuel was available, as carefully as the infantrymen in the desert managed water. The food for the German soldier varied by theatre and by the state of the supply lines, which on the Eastern Front were frequently disrupted. The German field ration, the Eisener portion, the iron ration kept as a last reserve, was compact and calorie-dense. The standard ration when supply was adequate included bread, which the Germans considered one of the more important ration components, a meat component, fat and spreads, and the ersatz coffee that replaced real coffee for most of the war. The ersatz coffee, made from roasted grain or chicory or various other substitutes, was not coffee, and the German soldier who remembered real coffee before the war did not pretend it was. But it was hot, and hot was what mattered in many conditions. The German private soldier who survived the Eastern Front was, by most accounts, one of the most proficient infantry soldiers in the world. The Eastern Front was a brutal education in survival and in tactics, and the soldiers who came through it had been through conditions that forced the development of skills and endurance that more comfortable theatres did not produce. But he also wanted to go home, and in his slit trench on the Eastern Front, or in his dugout, or in the ruins of a Russian village that the unit was holding, he thought about home in the way that all soldiers thought about home, with the specific acuity that distance and danger gave to the ordinary, and at night he slept, the same sleep, in a different cold, with a different uniform, the same body's need. Good night. The Japanese soldier. The Japanese soldier's experience in the Second World War was shaped by a cultural context different from the European soldiers, and the specific conditions of the Pacific and Asian theatres were different from those in Europe. The Pacific Island campaigns, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and many others, produced conditions of extraordinary physical difficulty. The jungle, the heat, the insects, the diseases, malaria and dysentery and dengue fever and the other tropical illnesses that could incapacitate a unit more effectively than the enemy. The Japanese infantryman on a Pacific island was fighting in terrain that worked against everyone equally, and which neither side had fully trained for. The jungle was dense, hot, wet, and full of things that would make you sick. Moving through it was slow and exhausting. Maintaining position in it required constant effort against the vegetation that grew back quickly wherever it had been cleared. The Japanese soldiers' training had emphasized endurance and the acceptance of hardship. The willingness to continue under conditions that European armies might consider grounds for withdrawal was a characteristic of Japanese military culture that produced both tactical effectiveness and, in the later stages of the war when supply chains had been severed and reinforcement was impossible, terrible suffering. On islands that had been cut off by American naval and air superiority, Japanese garrisons were reduced to living on whatever the island produced, which was often very little. The combination of reduced rations, tropical disease, and continued combat produced a progressive deterioration in the physical condition of the garrison. The soldier in these conditions maintained what he maintained because the alternative was to not maintain it. The rifle was cleaned, the position was defended, the watch was stood. The fundamental discipline of military life persisted past the point where comfort or adequate supply supported it. And at night, on the island that would not be resupplied, in the jungle that was both shelter and hazard, the Japanese soldier also slept, or tried to, in the heat, on the ground, listening for the sounds of the night that were different from the sounds that belonged to the night. The same listening, the same dark, the different insects, the same sleep. Good night. The supply chain. Behind every frontline soldier was an enormous logistical system that made his daily existence possible. The food in the Sompo box had to get from a factory in England to the soldiers' hands in Holland. The path between those 2 points involved canning facilities, transport to a port, loading onto ships, convoy across the Channel, unloading at a port in France or Belgium, transport by rail or road to a depot, forward transportation to the brigade supply point, further forward transportation to the battalion, and finally the carrying parties that brought the rations the last mile to the soldiers who would eat them. Each link in this chain could fail, and when it failed the soldier went without. Not usually without food entirely. Emergency reserves and the ability to supplement from local sources prevented complete failure most of the time, but the specific ration might not be available, or might arrive late, or might arrive in reduced quantity. The people who ran this supply chain were also soldiers, though they did not carry rifles and did not occupy front-line positions. The supply officer, the transport driver, the storeman at the depot, the sergeant who organised the carrying parties, all of them in uniform, all of them doing the work that made the front-line soldiers' work possible. Their daily lives were different from the infantrymen's. Less exposure to direct combat, more administrative work, more time in fixed positions and established facilities. But they were also in the field, also managing the privations of military service, also far from home. The cook at the company cookhouse, who produced the meals that the soldiers came back from the line for, this person had their own specific daily experience, the long hours at the field cookers, the management of limited resources to produce food that was adequate for many people at once, the satisfaction of producing something hot and edible in conditions where that was not easy. The cook was appreciated. The good cook was genuinely valued, and the quality of the company's meals was one of the things soldiers noted and discussed. Food that was hot and varied and reasonably well prepared was a real contribution to morale, and the cook who achieved this consistently was doing something important. The supply sergeant who ensured that the ammunition was at the right place before an operation, that the rations were forward in time, that the spare parts were available for the weapons that needed them. This person's competence or lack of it was felt by everyone whose operations depended on the supply chain functioning. The support was invisible when it worked and very visible when it did not. As the supply chain of your own life is invisible when it works and very visible when it does not. The chain that puts food in the refrigerator and light in the room and warmth in the house. All of it working tonight, invisibly, reliably, and you in the middle of it. Warm, fed, ready for sleep. Good night. The cigarette. The cigarette of the Second World. War deserves its own moment, because the cigarette was one of the most universal features of the soldier's experience across all the armies of all the nations involved. Cigarettes were issued as part of the ration in many armies. The British 5th cigarette was bland and functional. American cigarettes, Camels, Lucky Strikes, Chesterfields, were considered significantly better and were much sought after when Americans and British were in proximity. German soldiers received cigarettes in their rations. Japanese soldiers received cigarettes. The ubiquity of the cigarette in wartime service was not simply habit. The cigarette provided several things that the field situation made scarce. A moment of pause in the day's activity, a mild stimulant that helped maintain alertness during watches, a socially acceptable reason to stop and stand with another person, sharing a smoke. the minimal social interaction that was a psychological necessity, even in a context that generally constrained social interaction, and a specific sensory experience that was familiar and personal in an environment of unfamiliarity. The lighting of a cigarette in the dark, under cover to hide the light, with the specific small ritual of the lighter or the match. This was one of the most characteristic gestures of the war. The cupped hands, the sheltered flame, the first draw, the released breath of smoke, the cigarette burning down through 2 hours of watch. For non-smokers, and there were non-smokers even in the armies of the 1940s, the cigarette ration was currency. You carried your cigarettes and traded them for extra food, for small services, for the various items that the informal economy of the military operated on. The cigarette economy of the prisoner of war camp was the most developed version of this, described in many memoirs. The cigarette as the basic unit of exchange, the prices of everything denominated in cigarettes, the non-smoker who had cigarettes being relatively prosperous by the standards of the camp. But in the ordinary field situation, the cigarette was just the cigarette, lit at the end of the day's march, shared with the man in the neck-slit trench, smoked slowly in the few minutes before sleep to let the day settle, the cigarette burning down, the day burning down, the sleep close, good night. The seasons of the war. The war lasted through multiple seasons, and the seasons of the war had their own characters. Summer, long days of active operations where the daylight permitted. The heat in Italy, in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, the dust of North Africa, the warmth of the French summer of 1944. In the summer, the fighting was conducted in the full heat of the day, and the heat was itself a factor in the operational equation. Water, shade, the management of soldiers who were exhausted by the combination of exertion and temperature. Autumn, the onset of the mud in northern Europe, the shortening days, the first, cold. The October rains that turned the Italian valleys into rivers of mud. The October cold that arrived in the hedgerow country of Normandy after the summer fighting. Autumn was the season of the supply crisis and the logistics crisis, when the rapid advance of summer had outrun the supply lines, and the armies were forced to slow and consolidate. Winter, the most difficult season for the ordinary soldier in the European theatre. The cold of the Ardennes in December 1944, the coldest winter in decades. The cold of northern Italy in the mountains, the shorter days that limited the operational time available, the specific miseries of cold wet feet and cold wet hands, and the management of a weapon in temperatures where the oil froze. Spring, the renewed operations of 1945, the crossing of the Rhine, the final advance into Germany. The spring brought better conditions, longer days, drying mud, the improvement in weather that allowed the air forces to operate more consistently. The spring of 1945 was the spring of the war's ending in Europe, the long operation reaching its conclusion. Each season brought its specific conditions, and the soldier adapted to the conditions of the season as they changed. The adjustments were practical and continuous. The clothing modified, the maintenance routines modified, the ration adjusted to the temperature, the seasons turning through the years of the war. And now this season, whatever season it is, your season, your night within it, with its specific temperature and its specific dark, and sleep, good night, the weight of everything. Let us end where we began, with the weight. The weight of the kit that the infantryman carried throughout the war, the rifle, the helmet, the webbing, the pack, was the physical constant of his life in service. You became accustomed to it. You stopped noticing it in the way that you stopped noticing the weight of your own clothing. It became simply the condition of the body in uniform. But setting it down, the pack set against a wall, the webbing removed, the helmet placed beside the sleeping position, this was a relief that was felt even by those who had stopped noticing the weight. The body registered the absence. The shoulders, freed of the straps, felt lighter. The head, freed of the helmet, felt lighter. Setting down the weight was the beginning of rest. And rest was what the body had earned. Through the marching and the digging and the carrying and the watching and the waiting, the weight earned its setting down, as your day's weight earns its setting down. Whatever you have been carrying today, the actual weight of physical effort, or the different weight of the mental effort of the day, it can be set down now. It can wait. It will be there tomorrow when you need it. The pack against the wall, the rifle cleaned and beside you, the mess tin packed away, the kit organized for the morning, and now the rest that the body requires after the weight has been carried, the rest that the soldier in the slit trench found night after night through the years of the war, the same rest, available, here, now. The weight is down, the day is done, the night holds everything. Sleep, good night. The nurse. At the field hospital. The nurses and medical staff who served near the front lines had their own experience of the war that was different from the combat soldiers, but equally demanding and equally shaped by the conditions of field service. The field hospital was positioned as close to the front as was compatible with the care of the wounded, close enough for rapid evacuation of casualties, far enough back to be reasonably safe from direct fire. The casualty clearing station of the British Army, the field hospital of the American Army. These were mobile medical facilities that moved with the armies and processed the wounded from the forward positions. The work was intensely physical and intensely emotional. The wounded arrived continuously during periods of action. The surgery was performed in tents, by lamplight sometimes, with the sounds of the fighting audible in the distance. The nursing was the care of people in extremity, and the people in extremity were young and frightened and in pain. The nurses who worked in these conditions, both the military nurses and the orderlies who performed the physical work of moving patients and managing basic care, worked long hours. Not the regulated 8-hour shift of a peacetime hospital, the hours that the situation required, which in periods of heavy action might be 16 or 18 hours without adequate break. At the end of those hours they slept wherever they could, in the nurses' tents set up near the hospital facility, on a cot if one was available, on the ground if it was not. The sleep after a long shift in the field hospital was the sleep of exhaustion, not the troubled sleep that the emotional intensity of the work might suggest, though that came too in dreams and in the waking hours between shifts, but first and most immediately the deep, complete sleep of a body that had been in service for too many hours. The sound of the hospital in the night, the occasional sound of a patient in distress, managed quickly by whoever was on duty, the distant sound of the guns, the specific sounds of a temporary medical facility, the generators, if there were generators, the wind in the tent fabric, the specific acoustic quality of a structure made of canvas and poles, and in the nurses' accommodation, the other nurses sleeping. This same community of shared experience that existed among the soldiers in the Ain existed here in a different form. The knowledge of what they had seen and done, the shared context that made certain communication unnecessary because it was understood. They slept, as you sleep, in the dark, after the long hours. Good night. The radio operator. The radio operator was everywhere in the Second World War, at every level of command from the battalion to the army, and their work was the communication that held the military machine together. The radio set, the wireless set in British usage, was carried by the signaller, who was a specialist soldier whose primary responsibility was the operation and maintenance of the radio. The radio of the 1940s was not a small device. The man-portable sets that supported infantry operations at the platoon and company level were heavy by modern standards. The British 38 set weighed about 13 pounds, and the man carrying it was carrying this in addition to his personal kit and weapon. The radio operator worked the set continuously during operations, maintaining the communication net, passing messages up and down the chain of command, acknowledging receipt, noting the timings of traffic. The procedure for radio communication was formalized. Specific words for specific situations, the phonetic alphabet used for spelling, the authentication codes that verified the identity of those communicating. This formalized procedure served a practical purpose. It reduced ambiguity in communications over noisy, unreliable radio links. The specific words meant specific things, and they were used precisely because precision in communication could mean the difference between a misunderstood order and its correct execution. The radio operator listened through headphones for hours at a stretch, the static and the voice traffic and the atmospheric noise filling the ears. In the periods between traffic, the hiss of static was the sound of the communication net at rest, always there, waiting. At night in a static position, the radio net reduced to a checking schedule, the periodical contact that ensured all stations were still on the air. The operator on watch checked in at the scheduled time and responded to the check from higher command. Between the scheduled checks, the static, and sometimes the operator dozed, the headphones on, the static continuing, the awareness just sufficient to register the incoming traffic that would need a response, the half-sleep of the radio watch, the static as the background of the doze. And then the traffic came, and the tension sharpened, and the message was taken and acted upon, and then back to the static, which is its own kind of quiet, the white noise of the military night, as the quiet of your own night is its own kind of quiet, the background of the rest, simply there, while you sleep, good night. The letters never sent, some letters were never sent, written in the field, started in the pause between one thing and the next, and then interrupted by the order to move, by the resumption of activity, by the arrival of something that required immediate attention, and then the letter half written, folded into the pocket, and forgotten or lost, or simply never completed, or completed but not sent. The letter that went too far into what the writer was feeling, that said things the writer was not certain they wanted to say, that expressed fears or doubts, or the kind of vulnerability that the censor or the recipient might find difficult. The soldier's letter home was not always everything the soldier might have said if the conditions for saying it had been different. The censorship, the awareness of the recipient's anxiety, the military culture that favoured understatement and dry humour as the appropriate modes for talking about difficulty. All of these shaped what was written and what was not. What was not written stayed with the writer, the experience that had no adequate words, or whose adequate words could not be sent. The accumulation of this unwritten experience was part of what changed the soldiers who came home. Not all of it could be said. Some of it never could be, to people who had not been there. This is not unique to soldiers. The experience that resists communication, that cannot be adequately conveyed to those who did not share it, is part of many kinds of intense experience. The difficulty is specific and real, and it was felt by many veterans of the Second World War who found that the gap between their experience and the experience of those who had been at home was one of the more difficult features of the return. But at night, in the field, the unsent letter was its own kind of communication. The act of trying to write it, even when the writing was not completed, was a way of processing what had happened, of turning it into language even when the language could not be shared. And the sleep that followed, which was also a kind of processing, the night's work of consolidating the day's experience into memory, doing what it did regardless of whether the letter was written or not, the same sleep, the same work of the night, as it works in you, right now, taking the day, processing it, making it part of the memory that you carry forward. While you rest, sleep now, the night is doing its work. Good night. The sound of rain on a tent, the sound of rain on a tent. In the field, this sound accompanied many nights of the war. The canvas of the pup tent or the larger tent absorbing the impact of each raindrop. The cumulative sound of many drops, a soft, sustained percussion. This sound was not unpleasant, not when you were inside the tent, the rain outside and you within, the waterproof canvas keeping the water off, the interior dry while the exterior was wet. The rain sound was one of the more reliable background sounds of the field, and it was one that many soldiers associated specifically with the experience of being in the field. The contrast between wet outside and relatively dry inside, the sound of the boundary between those conditions. In a good tent, well pitched, the rain outside stayed outside. You were dry. The ground sheet was dry. The sleeping bag was dry. The rain continued overhead, its sound constant. In a less good tent, or a tent that had been in the field long enough for the canvas to start letting water through at the seams, the rain was less companionable. The drip that found the sleeping bag, the pooling of water at the low point of the ground sheet, the specific misery of the wet sleeping bag. But the best case, the well-pitched tent in the steady rain, was a specific comfort, enclosed, dry. The rain outside providing its own form of privacy, the sound masking the sounds of the position, the steady precipitation keeping attention focused on the interior rather than the exterior. These soldiers who slept well in the rain on those nights slept with the specific quality of sleep that rain induces when you're inside and dry. The sound of the rain organizing the attention around the immediate, the warm, the enclosed. The sound of the rain as permission to not be alert to the outside, because the outside was simply the rain. This is the sound of certain nights. Rain, if it is raining, or the equivalent, the sound of the night outside your window, whatever it is, organizing the attention, permitting the rest. The outside is outside, you are inside, and the sound of the outside, whatever it is simply the background of the inside, and the inside is here, and sleep is here. Good night. The very last night before coming home. For every soldier in the Second World War there was a last night in the field, not always recognised as such. You did not always know in advance that this would be the last night in this particular place, the last night in the field, the last night before the process of going home began. Sometimes it was known. The order had come, the ship was scheduled, the departure date was set. Sometimes it was not known until the day of, but there was a last night, a night in whatever sleeping space the war had provided at that particular moment. A night that was, in most ways, the same as the nights before it, the same kit, the same sounds, the same dark, except that the soldier in that last night might have known, or suspected, or hoped, that this was nearly over, that the accumulation of nights, the nights in the slit trench, the nights in the tent, the nights in the barn and the farmhouse and the rubble and the field, was coming to its end, that the next sleeping place would be a step closer to home, and the one after that another step, and eventually the sleeping place would be home, the last night in the field, the same sleep, but perhaps a different quality of it, lighter, the awareness of the transition ahead making a deeper sleep impossible, the anticipation and the relief and the anxiety of transition all present, or perhaps not lighter. Perhaps the last night was the deepest sleep of all, the body knowing that the long strain was ending, and taking the rest it had been accruing for months. We cannot know for any specific soldier, but the last night was there. And then came home, and home was a sleeping place that was not the field. And the sleeping was different, and gradually over weeks and months the body learned to sleep in safety again, learned to stay asleep rather than snapping awake at unfamiliar sounds, learned that the watch rotation was not coming, learned that the kit did not need to be beside the bed, learned to rest completely, as you rest completely, in your own home, in your own bed, in your own dark, tonight, the long line of soldiers resting, and you with them, after the day, before the morning, in the night that holds everyone equally. Sleep now. Good night. The physical routine. The soldier's body, after months or years in service, was in a specific physical condition, not the condition of the civilian who exercised occasionally and sat at a desk, not the condition of the elite athlete who trained systematically, the condition of someone who moved constantly under load in varying conditions without systematic training but with continuous physical demand. This body was lean. The rations were adequate but not generous, and the physical output was high. The body had processed its reserves of unnecessary tissue, and retained what was needed for the sustained physical work of military service. This body had specific strengths and specific vulnerabilities. The legs were strong from the arching, the shoulders and back were strong from the carrying, the hands were calloused from the digging and the handling of equipment, the feet were complicated, sometimes in excellent condition, hardened and toughened by the miles, sometimes in poor condition, blistered or worse from the wet and the cold. The body maintained itself as best it could on what was available, sleep when sleep could be had, food when food was available, the specific self-maintenance behaviours that military service allowed, the morning wash, the boot care, the inspection of the feet that the NCO required. These maintenance behaviours were not luxury. They were the minimum required to keep a body functional in the field. The body that was not maintained deteriorated faster than the body that was. The investment of the 15 minutes of daily maintenance was paid back in the continued functioning of the primary tool of the infantryman's trade, which was the body itself. At the end of the day, the body that had been used all day needed rest. Not just wanted rest, needed it in the physiological sense, the processes of repair and restoration that sleep enabled being genuinely necessary for the next day's functioning. The soldier who did not sleep became less effective over days. The accumulation of sleep deficit produced degraded judgment, slower reaction time, reduced physical performance. The military understanding of this was well enough developed that sleep management, the scheduling of rest, the rotation of watches, the provision of sleep time was considered a serious operational matter. Your body also needs sleep, not as a luxury, as a necessity. The same body, the same processes, the same genuine requirement, and the sleep that meets it is here, now. As simple as lying down and letting the body do what it knows to do. Good night. The horizon. The soldier in the field spent a great deal of time looking at the horizon, not for dramatic reasons, for practical ones. The horizon, or the tree line, or the crest of the ridge, or whatever defined the far edge of the visible terrain, was where the enemy might be. The habit of watching the far edge of the visible was a survival habit, developed early in field service and maintained continuously. This watching was not anxious. After enough time in the field, the watching was simply the way of being in the landscape. The eyes moved to the horizon automatically, registered what was there, and reported to the awareness that it was the same as before or different. The horizon in Europe, the grey sky over flat Dutch fields, the black line of trees in the distance, the occasional church steeple, the horizon in North Africa, the brown and pale blue of the desert, the heat shimmer that made distance uncertain, the horizon in Italy, the mountain line against the sky, the specific jagged profile of the particular ridge that the unit had been looking at for 3 weeks. Each theatre had its horizon, and the soldiers who were in that theatre knew it the way you know, the view from a window you look out of every day, the specific profile, the specific colour, the specific way the light changed on it through the day. At night the horizon disappeared. The far edge of the visible became the near edge of the invisible. The perimeter of the known contracted to what the immediate darkness allowed. A few feet, maybe tens of feet, depending on the moonlight and the stars. And the soldier, in the dark, listened to the darkness where the horizon had been. The same attention in a different mode. The same awareness directed at sounds rather than sights, and eventually the relief of sleep. The horizon released, the attention turned inward, or released entirely, and the dark that had been the unknown became simply the dark of sleep. As the dark around you is simply the dark of sleep, not the dark of the horizon, not the dark of the unknown, simply the dark of here, of your sleeping place, of tonight. The attention can release, the horizon can be let go. Sleep is here. Good night. The end of this story. Every night in the field eventually became the morning. The dark that had held the position since stand the previous evening gave way, very slowly, to the grey of pre-dawn, and then to the pale light of dawn, and then to the day. The soldier who had spent the night in the slit trench or the pup tent or the barn came into the morning, the watch done, the night past. The stand-to of dawn, the alert period at first light, when an attack was considered most likely, was conducted, and then it was over, and the morning could begin. The mess tin for the tea, the ration opened, the rifle checked, the kit organised for the day's movement, and the day that followed the night, which was the same kind of day in its structure as the day that had preceded the night. The marching or the working parties or the static routine, the meals when they came, the watches in rotation, the maintenance of the equipment that needed maintaining, day after day, until the day the war ended, and then the return, and home, where the sleeping was different, and the mornings were different, and the days were different, and all of it was the ordinary life that the soldier had thought about in every quiet moment of the field, that had been the reference point for everything that was not ordinary, that had waited for the return, the ordinary, which is where you are, tonight, in your ordinary place, after your ordinary day, the ordinary that is the most valuable thing, because it was what was missed when it was gone, and it is here now, warm, quiet, yours, the kettle, when you want it, the bed, which is a bed, the dark, which is just the dark, and the sleep, which is just sleep, the same sleep that the soldier found in the slit trench and in the tent and in the barn and finally, eventually at home, the same sleep that everyone finds when the day is done and the night is here and the body has been given the chance to do what it needs to do, which is sleep, right here, right now, after everything, sleep. The day is done, the night is here, the kit is set aside, the tea is cold, the rifle is cleaned, and sleep is available, as it has always been available, as it is now. Take it. Good night. The quiet sector. Not every part of the front was active at all times. In a large theatre of operations, the fighting was concentrated in certain sectors, while others were quiet. A quiet sector was a length of front where neither side was currently conducting active operations, where both sides occupied their positions, maintained their watch schedules, conducted their patrols, but where the intensity of combat was low or absent for extended periods. Units were sometimes sent to quiet sectors to rest and refit after periods of heavy fighting. The quiet sector was not comfortable. You were still in the field, still in forward positions, still subject to the random incoming shell or the night patrol. But the sustained intensity of an active operation was absent, and this absence was itself a form of rest. In a quiet sector, the daily routine was maintained, but without the pressure of immediate operational demands. The positions were improved. The equipment was maintained more thoroughly than the pressure of active operations had allowed. The soldiers had time to write letters, to sleep more adequately, to eat more regularly. The quiet sector was where soldiers recovered to the extent recovery was possible in the field. Not fully. Full recovery required distance from the front, the rest, and safety of a rear area. But the quiet sector was a moderation of the conditions, a partial lowering of the sustained alertness that the active front demanded. After a period in a quiet sector, the unit was sometimes sent back into active operations. The cycle continued, active, quiet, through the campaign. The quiet sector night was different from the active front night. The sounds were fewer, the intensity of the watch was lower, though not absent. the sleep was somewhat better. Not peaceful exactly, but quieter. The gradations of quiet within the war, each one valuable, each one a partial rest, and your quiet tonight is a fuller quiet, the quiet of the safe, the quiet of home, the quiet of a night without the front, without the slit trench, without the watch rotation, simply the quiet, which is here, which is enough, which is all that sleep requires. Good night. The simple inventory. At the end of the day, the soldier made a simple inventory, not formal, not written down, the internal accounting of what had been done and what was ready for tomorrow. The rifle, cleaned, ready. The boots, dried as much as possible. Dubbin applied if available. The water bottle, refilled at the water point. The ration, eaten. The next ration located. The kit, organised for morning movement if movement was required. The letters from home in the breast pocket, as always. The peculium of small items, the photographs, the small personal objects that connected the soldier to the life before the uniform, in the specific pocket where they always were. Everything accounted for, everything as ready as it could be made, and then the lying down. And the inventory complete, the mind could release its accounting function. Nothing was outstanding, nothing required attention tonight. The preparation for tomorrow was as complete as it could be made, and sleep was next. Your own inventory for tonight. Whatever you needed to check is checked. Whatever you needed to prepare is prepared. The morning will bring what it brings, but that is morning. This is tonight. And tonight is for sleep. The inventory is complete, the kit is ready, the day is done, and sleep is here. Take it. Good night.